I thought writing a check to save my parents from living on the street meant I was finally part of the family. I sacrificed my savings, my credit, and 3 years of my life to keep a roof over their heads. But the moment the ink dried on the final payment, my father dragged my bags to the porch and told me my lease was up. I stood there betrayed and homeless until I remembered exactly what name was on the deed. The heavy wooden front door swung open with a violent crack against the exterior siding. My father, Richard, stood in the doorway with his face flushed red. He gripped the handle of my vintage leather suitcase, the one I had used every day for my business trips. With a sudden and brutal heave, he threw the suitcase down the concrete porch steps. It hit the pavement hard. I heard the distinct snap of the brass latch breaking. My clothes spilled out onto the driveway right next to the carefully manicured flower beds I had paid a landscaper to fix just last month. I stood at the bottom of the steps. I was 32 years old, wearing my work suit from a long shift managing the regional logistics hub, and I was staring at my father in absolute shock. I asked him what he thought he was doing. I asked him why my belongings were being thrown out of the house like garbage. Richard crossed his arms over his chest. He looked down at me with a sneer that I had seen 1,000 times during my childhood. He told me it was time for me to move on. He said I had overstayed my welcome, and that a grown man should not be living under his parents' roof. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I pointed at the house and reminded him that I was not a teenager living in his basement for free. I demanded to know how he could stand there and talk about overstaying my welcome when I was the only reason he even had a roof over his head. I took a step up the stairs and told him he had lost his mind if he thought he could evict me with zero notice on a Friday afternoon. Behind the screen door, my mother Susan appeared. She had a balled-up tissue in her hand and was already putting on her best crying face. She pressed her hand against the mesh screen and told me to lower my voice before the neighbors heard. She said I was upsetting my father and that I needed to be respectful of his decisions. I laughed, but there was absolutely no humor in it. I looked right at my mother and asked her where this respect was 3 years ago. I asked her if she remembered the tearful phone call she made to me when the bank was 60 days away from taking the house. I reminded them both loudly so the neighbors could absolutely hear that they were drowning in debt. I reminded them that I drained my entire savings account to stop the foreclosure. I looked back at Richard and shouted that I had poured $85,000 of my own hard-earned money into this property to save them from bankruptcy. Richard did not even flinch. He adjusted his collar and said that family members help each other out. He said I owed them for raising me, for feeding me, and for putting clothes on my back when I was a child. He called my financial sacrifice a basic duty. Then he told me that my duty was finished and I needed to vacate the premises immediately. I asked him if he was completely insane. I explained that $85,000 was not a gift. I reminded him that I gave up my own apartment, moved into my childhood bedroom, and worked 60-hour weeks at the logistics firm just to cover their property taxes, their overdue utility bills, and their massive mortgage arrears. I told him he could not just throw me out without a legal eviction notice, let alone without paying me back a single dime. Susan started sobbing louder. She said I was being materialistic and greedy. She accused me of holding money over their heads like a tyrant. She said a good son would never speak to his parents about money in such a vulgar way. She told me I should be grateful they allowed me to stay in the guest room for 3 years. I stepped closer to the door, my anger boiling over into pure clarity. I realized this was not a sudden argument. My bags were already packed. My winter coats were folded. My shoes were neatly placed in a plastic bin sitting on the porch. They had planned this. They had waited for me to leave for my shift at the warehouse, packed up my entire life, and waited by the door to lock me out. I asked them why today. I asked what the rush was and why they were suddenly treating me like an intruder in the house I had financially rescued. Before Richard could answer, a shiny new white SUV turned onto our quiet suburban street. It rolled slowly past the neighborhood association signs and pulled straight into our driveway, its tires crushing one of my spilled dress shirts against the concrete. The engine cut off and the driver's side door opened. My younger brother Kevin stepped out. He was 28, fresh off a luxurious 2-week honeymoon in Hawaii, and dressed in designer casual clothes that I knew for a fact he could not afford on his own. He walked around the front of the vehicle with a bright, arrogant smile on his face. The passenger door opened and his new wife, Chloe, climbed out. She was holding a massive iced coffee and carrying a designer tote bag. She looked at my clothes scattered on the driveway, stepped carefully over my broken suitcase, and did not even offer a word of apology. Kevin walked up to the porch, completely ignoring the fact that I was shaking with anger. He clapped his hands together and looked up at our parents. He shouted a cheerful greeting, asking if the place was ready. I stared at Kevin. I asked him what he was doing here. Kevin laughed, sliding his hands into his pockets. He looked at me like I was a slightly annoying bellhop. He said he and Chloe were moving in today. He smiled and casually thanked me for keeping the place warm for them. He said it was a huge relief to know the house was ready for them to start their new lives. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind with a sickening crunch. I looked from Kevin to my father and then to my mother hiding behind the screen. The eviction was not a punishment for anything I had done. It was a clearing out. My parents had used my money to pull the house out of foreclosure. They had used my steady income to stabilize their credit and pay off the back taxes. And now that the house was secure, they were handing it over to the golden child. They were giving Kevin and Chloe a debt-free home to start their marriage, completely discarding me in the process. I turned my attention back to Kevin. I told him he had to be joking. I told him he knew exactly how much money I put into this house. I asked him how he could possibly think he was just going to waltz in and take over after I did all the heavy lifting. Chloe scoffed loudly. She stepped up next to Kevin and linked her arm through his. She looked me up and down with absolute disdain. She said it was a family home, and since Kevin was the one starting a real family, it was only right that they got the house. She actually used the word real family, implying that my single status made me entirely worthless to the family legacy. She told me that Richard and Susan had promised them the house as a wedding gift. She said they were planning to turn my bedroom into a nursery and that my dark, depressing furniture really needed to be cleared out by the end of the weekend. I felt a massive wave of heat rush to my face. I looked at my father again. I asked him to look me in the eye and tell me this was true. I asked him if he had actually promised the house I saved to my little brother. Richard did not look ashamed. He looked proud. He puffed out his chest and said Kevin was building a future. He said Kevin and Chloe needed a solid foundation and that a house was the best way to ensure his future grandchildren had a safe place to grow up. He told me I was a bachelor with no responsibilities, making a good salary at the logistics company, and that I could easily find an apartment somewhere else. He said I had done my part for the family and now it was time for me to step aside so Kevin could thrive. I asked about my $85,000. I demanded to know how they planned to pay me back for the mortgage arrears, the taxes, and the roof repairs. Kevin rolled his eyes and groaned. He told me to stop being so dramatic. He said the money was a gift to our parents and that bringing it up now was just tacky. He told me I was ruining his move-in day and that I needed to pack up the rest of my trash and leave. Susan spoke up again from behind the screen. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. She said she loved me, but I had to understand that Kevin was the future of the family. She said God would reward me for my generosity, but right now I needed to pack my car and go. I stood there on the driveway surrounded by my scattered belongings. I looked at the three of them, my father standing tall and arrogant, my mother using religion and tears to cover up massive financial theft, my brother smiling smugly while his entitled wife measured the porch for new planters. They truly believed they had won. They believed they had successfully used me as an ATM for 3 years, fixed their terrible financial mistakes, and secured a beautiful, expensive suburban home for their favorite son. They thought I was just going to walk away, rent a cheap apartment, and absorb an $85,000 loss because of family duty. I stopped arguing. The anger inside me suddenly shifted into something icy and completely calm. I realized that trying to reason with people who viewed me as nothing more than a financial stepping stone was a waste of breath. They did not care about my sacrifices. They did not care about my future. They only cared about what they could extract from me. I slowly bent down and picked up my broken leather suitcase. I gathered my scattered dress shirts and stuffed them back inside. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the silence stretch out over the driveway. Kevin shifted his weight, looking slightly annoyed that I was not having a total meltdown. Chloe checked her nails. Richard kept his arms crossed, acting like a bouncer at a cheap club. When I finally zipped the broken bag closed, I stood up straight. I walked up the concrete steps until I was eye level with my father. I did not yell. I did not threaten him. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping all the emotion out of it. I looked Richard directly in the eyes and asked him one final time. I asked, "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Richard glared at me. He told me to get off his property. He stepped back and slammed the heavy front door directly in my face. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final thud. I stood on the porch for 3 seconds, listening to Kevin and Chloe cheering inside the house. Then I turned around, walked to my car, and threw my broken suitcase into the trunk. They wanted me off their property. They wanted to pretend I was just a renter who could be tossed aside. But they had completely forgotten who signed the paperwork at the bank 3 years ago. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away knowing exactly what I was going to do next. The morning sun glared off the cracked windshield of the bulky rented box truck as I navigated the familiar turns of my childhood neighborhood. The streets were quiet and draped in the peaceful stillness of a Saturday morning. Sprinklers ticked back and forth across immaculate green lawns. A gentle breeze pushed fallen leaves down the clean gutters. It was a picturesque community filled with expensive cars and manicured hedges, the exact kind of place where terrible secrets are hidden behind expensive front doors. I parked the heavy diesel vehicle directly in front of the house, letting the engine idle for a moment before twisting the key. The rumbling stopped, replaced by the sound of birds chirping in the old oak trees. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the front windows. My plan was straightforward and completely devoid of emotion. I wanted to pack my remaining belongings, load my furniture into the back of this truck, and leave this miserable place behind forever. I climbed out of the cab, grabbed a stack of flattened cardboard boxes from the cargo bay, and walked up the concrete driveway. I reached the front porch and pulled my heavy keyring from my pocket. I separated the familiar brass house key and slid it into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I jiggled the handle, thinking the old metal was just sticking like it sometimes did during the humid summer months. I pushed my shoulder against the heavy wood and tried to force the key to twist. The mechanism was completely frozen. I pulled the key out and inspected the lock closely. The metal faceplate was brand new. It was a shiny brushed nickel finish, a totally different brand and style than the dull brass hardware we had used for over a decade. The realization hit me like a physical punch to the chest. In less than 24 hours, my own family had hired a locksmith to permanently bar me from the property. They had changed the locks to ensure I could not even pack my own socks without their permission. I dropped the cardboard boxes onto the porch floor. I pressed my thumb against the illuminated doorbell button and held it there, listening to the electronic chime echo loudly deep inside the hallways of the house. Heavy footsteps approached the entryway. The deadbolt clicked, and the door cracked open just a few inches, stopped by a heavy brass security chain. Chloe stared at me through the narrow gap. She was wearing an expensive silk robe and holding a steaming ceramic coffee mug. She looked incredibly annoyed that I had disturbed her peaceful morning routine. I kept my voice flat and told her to unchain the door so I could get my things. Chloe took a slow, dramatic sip from her mug and informed me that it was far too early for uninvited visitors. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten so hard my teeth ached. I reminded her that I lived there, that my legal property was inside those walls, and that I had a massive moving truck parked aggressively on the street. She sighed, closed the door to undo the chain, and then opened it a fraction wider. She kept her body firmly planted in the frame blocking my entry. She told me I could come inside for exactly 15 minutes to grab my clothes and my bathroom toiletries, but absolutely nothing else. I asked her what she meant by nothing else. I had an entire bedroom suite upstairs, a custom leather sectional in the living room, and a brand new high-efficiency washer and dryer set in the laundry room. I had purchased all of those items with my own money over the last 2 years, while they were busy spending their money on vacations. Chloe smirked, leaning her shoulder against the doorframe. She confidently declared that the large appliances and the living room set were now considered permanent fixtures of the house. She said that since Richard and Susan generously gifted the home to Kevin and her for their wedding, all the furnishings inside came with the property. I stared at her, genuinely struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of her audacity. I carefully explained that a couch is not a structural fixture. I told her I bought that exact leather sectional for $4,000 just 6 months ago, and I had the digital receipt in my email to prove it. I also reminded her that the washer and dryer were purchased on my personal credit card because the old ones broke down and our parents simply refused to replace them. Chloe waved her hand dismissively, nearly spilling her coffee. She said Kevin really liked the comfortable couch and that they obviously needed the washer to clean their clothes. She actually smiled and suggested that I should leave those expensive items behind as a housewarming gift to celebrate their new marriage. When I firmly told her that I was taking every single thing I bought, her smug expression vanished instantly. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut in my face and rapidly engaged the deadbolt. I heard her muffled voice yelling up the stairs for Kevin to call our father. I did not bang my fists on the door. I did not yell through the glass windows. I simply turned around, walked back down the long driveway, and climbed back into the sweltering cab of the moving truck. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket and dialed the non-emergency line for the local police department. I explained the situation to the police dispatcher clearly and calmly. I stated that I was a legal resident being illegally denied access to my personal property by family members, and I formally requested a civil standby officer to keep the peace. The dispatcher took down my information, confirmed my address, and promised to send a patrol unit as soon as one was available. I sat in the baking heat of the truck cab and waited, watching the house. 30 minutes later, a heavy police cruiser turned onto our quiet cul-de-sac. The officer did not use the siren, but the flashing red and blue light bar reflected brightly off the windows of the neighboring houses. A second police cruiser pulled up right behind the first, parking at a sharp angle that completely blocked the street. In this upscale suburban neighborhood, 2 police cars blocking a driveway with their lights flashing was the equivalent of a massive, unavoidable scandal. I saw Mrs. Gable from across the street open her front door and step onto her lawn in her pink pajamas, shielding her eyes from the sun to watch the drama unfold. Another neighbor down the block completely stopped walking his golden retriever, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk to stare at my parents' house. I stepped out of the truck and greeted the 2 uniformed officers. I showed them my state driver's license, which had the house address printed right on the front. I pulled up my email and showed them the digital receipts for the leather sectional, the expensive mattress, and the heavy laundry machines. The older officer nodded slowly, adjusting his utility belt. He walked up the driveway with his partner right behind him and knocked heavily on the front door with a metal flashlight. It took almost 2 agonizing minutes for someone to answer. When the door finally opened, my father was standing there looking absolutely horrified. Richard was wearing a plaid bathrobe, and his face drained of all color as he looked at the armed officers on his porch, and then at the neighborhood gossips watching eagerly from the sidewalks. The older officer explained in a loud, commanding voice that they were there to ensure a peaceful transfer of property. He instructed my father to step aside immediately so I could enter the premises and retrieve my belongings. Richard tried to argue, his voice shaking with humiliation. He quietly tried to tell the police officers that this was just a simple family misunderstanding and that I was a troubled son, causing unnecessary trouble for attention. The officer cut him off mid-sentence, stating firmly that I had legal proof of ownership and a valid residential address on my state license. The officer crossed his arms and asked if Richard wanted to turn this civil matter into a formal theft investigation right there on the front lawn in front of everyone. My father looked at the police, then looked nervously at Mrs. Gable, who was practically taking notes across the street. The public embarrassment was entirely too much for his fragile ego to handle. His desperate need to maintain his flawless image as a respectable suburban patriarch completely shattered his false confidence. He stepped back into the foyer and silently waved me inside, his eyes burning with rage. I spent the next 2 grueling hours walking back and forth under the watchful, silent gaze of the police officers. Kevin and Chloe stayed locked inside the master bedroom upstairs, entirely too cowardly to face me or answer any questions from the cops. My mother stayed hidden in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing the exact same pan in the sink and refusing to look in my direction as I passed by. The physical labor was exhausting, but the emotional silence in the house was far worse. I carried boxes of my winter clothes, my personal files, and my expensive electronics past the kitchen. Not once did she step out to apologize. Not once did she ask me where I was going to sleep that night. She just kept the running water on full blast to drown out the noise of my departure. I realized then that a mother's love in this house was entirely conditional upon my financial usefulness. I hauled the heavy leather couch out the front door section by section. I went into the laundry room, disconnected the water hoses from the washing machine, drained the excess dirty water into a plastic bucket, and strapped the heavy appliances securely onto a metal hand truck. I rolled every single piece of my property down the driveway and up the metal ramp into the dark cargo bay of the box truck. My shirt was completely soaked in sweat, and my hands were blistered, but I did not stop until the job was done. When the house was finally stripped of everything I legally owned, I stood in the empty living room for a moment to catch my breath and wipe my forehead. Richard walked out of the hallway and stood in the center of the room. His face was twisted with absolute hatred. He looked at the deep indentations in the plush carpet where the couch used to be. He looked at the empty spaces on the walls. He stepped closer to me and spoke in a low, venomous whisper. He told me I had disgraced the entire family by bringing the police to his front door. He said I was a petty, vindictive, and miserable person. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest and declared that as of this exact moment I was completely dead to him. He told me to never call them, never visit them, and never contact them again for the rest of my life. I looked at him without a single shred of sadness or emotion. I told him he finally got his wish. I turned my back on my father, walked out the front door, and left it wide open behind me. I walked down the driveway, pulled the heavy metal door of the box truck down, and secured the thick metal latch. I shook hands with the 2 police officers and thanked them sincerely for their time and patience. They gave me a quick nod of understanding, got back into their cruisers, turned off their flashing lights, and drove away down the street. I climbed up into the driver's seat of the moving truck, my muscles aching fiercely from the heavy lifting and the overwhelming stress of the morning. The drive away felt surreal. For 3 years, that house had consumed my entire life. Every paycheck, every bonus, every spare weekend was dedicated to keeping the roof over their heads. Now I was driving away with nothing but a broken suitcase, a rented truck full of used furniture, and a completely fractured family. I started the roaring engine, put the heavy vehicle into gear, and drove out of the neighborhood without once looking back in the rearview mirror. I just wanted to find a cheap roadside motel park, the truck safely take a hot shower, and figure out my next move. About 10 miles down the interstate highway, my phone buzzed loudly in the plastic cup holder. Then it buzzed again. It kept vibrating with a rapid, continuous series of automated notifications. I kept my eyes focused on the busy road until I reached a long red traffic light at an intersection. Then I finally picked up the device. My lock screen was completely flooded with urgent alerts from the regional power, water, and gas companies. I unlocked the phone and opened my email application to read the full messages. My stomach completely dropped, replaced by a cold, sickening feeling of dread. The automated emails confirmed that 3 separate utility accounts for my parents' house had just been successfully transferred entirely into my name. I stared at the bold black text on the bright screen, reading the numbers over and over again to make sure I was not hallucinating. The utility accounts were not just transferred into my name. They carried over the massive unpaid past due balances that my parents had been hiding. The electricity account alone was $1,200 in the red. The water and gas bills added another $800 to the total debt. Susan had waited until I was completely distracted by the police officers and the exhausting moving process. She had gone onto her computer, logged into the utility portals, used my social security number, which she had memorized years ago, and fraudulently assumed my identity to dump their massive financial debts squarely onto my personal credit profile. The traffic light turned green. A large commercial truck honked loudly behind me, snapping me out of my shock. I dropped the phone back into the cup holder and pressed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. I stared out at the highway ahead of me, realizing with absolute certainty that the war for the house had not ended on the front porch. It had only just begun. The flickering neon sign outside my ground floor window cast a sickly red glow across the stained floral bedspread of the roadside motel. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the bright screen of my laptop. The room smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. The window air conditioning unit rattled loudly, barely pushing out any cool air to fight the sweltering heat of the afternoon. But the physical discomfort of my surroundings meant absolutely nothing compared to the financial disaster staring back at me from the glowing display. The utility company website was open, displaying a bold red banner across the top of my account dashboard. It indicated an immediate disconnection warning for severe non-payment. The electricity bill alone was sitting at $1,240. The water and gas accounts pushed the total debt well over $2,000. These were not my bills. These were accounts I had never opened. My credit score was my absolute pride and joy. For 3 long years, while I dumped every spare dollar I earned into saving my parents from foreclosure, I maintained my personal credit with militant discipline. I never missed a single payment on anything. I never carried a balance on my credit cards. I knew that one day I would need to buy my own house and build my own life, and a pristine credit profile was the only way to achieve that goal. Now my mother had deliberately weaponized my social security number to attach massive delinquent debts to my spotless financial record. If these accounts went into collections, my credit score would plummet by over 100 points. It would ruin my chances of ever securing a mortgage or a decent apartment lease in the future. The sheer calculation behind her betrayal was breathtaking. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the devastating consequences it would have on my life, and she did it anyway just to protect Kevin and his new wife from having to pay for their own hot water. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the toll-free customer service number for the Regional Power Authority. I navigated the frustrating maze of automated robotic menus, punching in the fraudulent account number with shaking fingers. After 30 agonizing minutes of listening to distorted classical hold music, a fraud investigation specialist named Brenda finally answered the line. I explained the situation to her with slow, deliberate precision. I told her I did not reside at the property, I did not authorize the transfer of service, and I was the victim of identity theft. Brenda was professional but completely uncompromising. She explained that because the transfer was executed using my correct social security number, my date of birth, and my previous residential address, the automated system flagged it as a completely legitimate customer request. She told me that family fraud was incredibly common in her line of work, but the utility company could not simply reverse the charges based on an angry phone call. To initiate a formal fraud investigation and remove the massive debt from my name, I had to provide a sworn police report documenting the identity theft. I thanked Brenda, hung up the phone, and took a deep, steadying breath. The thought of sending the police to investigate my own mother made my stomach turn. Despite everything they had done to me, despite my broken suitcase being thrown on the porch and the locks being changed, a small part of me still hesitated. I decided to give her one final chance to fix the situation quietly. I dialed my mother's cell phone number. It rang 4 times before she finally answered. Susan answered with a bright, cheerful tone, acting as if the horrific events of the weekend had never happened. She asked how my little motel room was treating me, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. I completely ignored her pleasantries and cut straight to the point. I told her I was looking at the fraudulent utility accounts she had set up in my name. I told her I knew exactly what she did, how she did it, and how much money was past due. The cheerful tone vanished from her voice, instantly replaced by a cold, defensive sharpness. She sighed loudly into the receiver, sounding more annoyed than guilty. She told me I was overreacting to a simple administrative task. She claimed she was just trying to manage the complicated household expenses and that putting the bills in my name was a temporary solution until Kevin and Chloe got settled into their new jobs. I asked her how a $1,200 past due balance on the electricity alone was a temporary solution. I demanded that she log back into the utility portals, take her massive debts off my social security number, and put the accounts in her own name or Kevin's name immediately. Susan scoffed loudly. She told me I was being incredibly selfish. She said I made a fantastic salary as a logistics manager and that a couple of $1,000s was practically pennies to me. She argued that Kevin was just starting out in his adult life and that he and Chloe were desperately trying to save up money to build a beautiful nursery for a future baby. She actually tried to use a hypothetical unborn grandchild to justify committing a federal crime against her own son. I told her this was not a casual negotiation about family finances. I explained to her in very simple terms that she had committed identity theft, which is a felony, and that it was actively destroying my credit score. I warned her that if she did not reverse the fraudulent transfer by the end of the day, I would walk directly into the local police station and file a formal criminal report for fraud. Susan let out a loud, mocking laugh. She told me I would never do such a terrible thing. She said I was entirely too weak to send my own mother to jail, and that I was just making empty threats to ruin Kevin's happiness. She told me to stop being a dramatic, greedy monster and to just pay the bills like a good brother. Then she hung up the phone. I lowered the phone from my ear. The hesitation was completely gone. The lingering sense of family loyalty evaporated the exact moment she called me a monster for refusing to pay for my brother's electricity. I grabbed my car keys, walked out of the cheap motel room, and drove straight to the local police precinct. The police station lobby was cold and sterile, smelling strongly of floor wax and stale coffee. I walked up to the thick glass partition and told the desk sergeant I needed to report a severe case of identity theft. A young detective brought me into a small interview room and handed me a thick stack of formal complaint forms. I sat at the metal table and filled out every single detail without an ounce of regret. I provided my mother's full legal name, her home address, the exact dates of the fraudulent transfers, and the specific dollar amounts of the stolen services. I handed over the printed copies of the automated emails I had received. The detective took my sworn statement, stamped the paperwork, and provided me with the official case number. He looked at me closely and warned me that family fraud cases often led to actual arrests. He asked if I was fully prepared for that outcome. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I absolutely was. I drove back to the motel and immediately uploaded the scanned police report to the utility company fraud portal. I called Brenda back on the direct extension she had provided. She verified the police report number in her system, reviewed my sworn statement, and immediately froze the fraudulent accounts. She assured me the massive debt would be completely scrubbed from my credit profile by the following morning. But more importantly, she informed me of the standard company protocol. Because the accounts were established through fraudulent means, the utility company was legally required to terminate the active service at the property immediately. They could not leave the power running under a stolen identity, and the real homeowners would have to reapply for service from scratch. It was Friday afternoon. The temperature outside was hovering in the high 90s, promising a brutally hot and humid weekend. In my quiet suburban hometown, the Regional Power Authority operated with brutal efficiency when it came to fraud and non-payment. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the automated shutoff order was successfully executed. I was sitting in my motel room when my phone buzzed with a final confirmation email from the power company. The electrical service at my parents' house had been officially disconnected. I pictured the scene in my head perfectly. Kevin and Chloe were likely unpacking their designer luggage in my old bedroom, enjoying the central air conditioning when the vents suddenly went completely dead. The television would have clicked off. The lights in the kitchen would have vanished. The brand new refrigerator, fully stocked with expensive groceries, would slowly start to warm up in the sweltering heat of the house. They had stolen my property, locked me out, and tried to ruin my financial future. Now they were sitting in pitch-black darkness on a Friday evening with absolutely no way to turn the lights back on. Instead of calling me to apologize or begging for a logical solution, Kevin chose a completely different path. He realized the power company would not restore service without a massive cash deposit and a thorough identity verification process that he simply could not pass. Furious and humiliated by his sudden lack of electricity, my brother decided to wage a massive social war against me. He refused to admit to anyone that our mother had committed a felony. He refused to acknowledge the unpaid bills. Instead, he painted himself as a helpless victim of my sudden, unprovoked cruelty. Kevin immediately reached out to the most powerful social network in our entire community. He called Pastor Miller, the head of the large community church our family had attended for nearly 2 decades. My parents had built their entire social reputation inside the walls of that church. They hosted potlucks, they sat in the front row every Sunday, and they projected an image of absolute moral perfection. Kevin weaponized that entire network against me in a matter of hours. He told the pastor and the church elders a completely fabricated story. He claimed that I was furiously jealous about having to move out of the house and that I had maliciously hacked into the utility accounts to shut off their power out of pure spite. He told them that his beautiful new wife was suffering in the terrible heat and that our elderly parents were stumbling around in the dark because of my greedy, vindictive behavior. He completely omitted the fact that I had saved the house from foreclosure. He erased the $85,000 I had sacrificed. He transformed me into a ruthless villain who hated his own family. The church community, blinded by their long-standing friendship with my parents, swallowed every single word of his lie. By the time the sun went down on Friday night, my phone began to fill with angry text messages from people I had known since childhood, demanding to know how I could do something so evil to my own flesh and blood. Kevin had successfully turned my entire hometown against me, setting the stage for a public confrontation that none of them were truly prepared for. The cheap plastic clock sitting on the motel nightstand clicked past 9 in the morning on Saturday, when my cell phone vibrated violently against the wood. I did not recognize the number flashing on the bright screen at first. It was a local area code, but it was not saved in my personal contacts. I swiped the glass screen and answered with a cautious and incredibly tired greeting. A deep and terribly familiar voice echoed through the small speaker. It was Pastor Miller. He was the man who had baptized me when I was a teenager. He was the man who had eaten Sunday dinners at our family dining room table for over a decade. But this morning his tone lacked any of the warmth and grace I'd grown up with. Instead, he spoke with a slow and calculated, patronizing drawl. It was the exact kind of voice a disappointed school principal uses when speaking to a juvenile delinquent. He told me he was calling to check in on my spiritual well-being. He said he had spoken extensively to my younger brother Kevin late the previous night, and that the entire family was in a state of profound emotional distress. I took a deep breath and tried to explain what had actually happened. I started to mention the fraudulent utility accounts and the illegal lockout orchestrated by my own parents. Pastor Miller simply talked right over me. He lowered his voice into a fake whisper of deep pastoral concern. He told me that greed was a powerful and insidious poison. He suggested that my sudden obsession with material wealth had completely blinded me to the sacred bond of family. He actually offered to set up weekly counseling sessions in his private office so we could pray away the anger and jealousy that had corrupted my heart. He said turning off the electricity on a newlywed couple was a wicked act of vengeance and that God was watching my cruel behavior. I realized instantly that Kevin had completely rewritten reality. Pastor Miller was not calling to hear both sides of the story or to mediate a fair resolution. He was calling to deliver a strict moral lecture based entirely on my brother's fabricated lies. I did not yell into the phone. I did not argue with his completely misguided assumptions. I calmly thanked the pastor for his concern, ended the call, and made a firm decision. Hiding in a cheap motel room and avoiding my hometown would only prove their false narrative right. If they wanted to play a public game of reputation destruction in front of the entire congregation, I was going to look them right in the eyes while they did it. Sunday morning arrived with a suffocating blanket of heavy summer humidity. I put on my best tailored charcoal suit, tied a perfect Windsor knot, and drove across town to the massive brick building of our community church. I had attended weekly services in this exact building for nearly 20 years. I knew the names of the volunteer ushers, the choir director, and the elderly women who organized the charity bake sales every single autumn. Walking through the heavy oak double doors usually felt like stepping into a safe and welcoming second home. Today it felt exactly like walking into a hostile courtroom where the jury had already decided my fate. The moment my leather dress shoes tapped against the polished tile of the expansive lobby, the ambient, joyful chatter dropped into a sudden and deeply uncomfortable silence. Heads turned in my direction from every corner of the large room. Eyes darted away just as quickly when I tried to make direct eye contact. People I had known for my entire adult life suddenly found the intricate floral patterns on the carpet absolutely fascinating. I kept my posture perfectly straight and walked purposefully toward the main sanctuary. Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman who had practically helped raise Kevin and me during summer camp, stood by the weekly bulletin table. I offered her a polite smile and a warm good morning. She looked at me with absolute disgust, pulled her knitted floral shawl tighter around her shoulders, and deliberately turned her back to me without saying a single word. The message was incredibly clear and devastatingly effective. The poison of my brother's lies had spread to every corner of the congregation. I took a seat in the very back row, far away from my usual spot near the front where my parents always sat. Throughout the agonizing hour of hymns and scripture readings, I could feel the heavy weight of judgmental stares burning into the back of my neck. Pastor Miller stood at the wooden pulpit and delivered a lengthy, impassioned sermon about the importance of forgiveness and the terrible dangers of material obsession. He looked directly at my row multiple times during his speech. When the final prayer concluded and the choir began their closing song, the congregation poured out of the wooden pews and into the lobby. I tried to make a quiet and dignified exit, but a group of older men deliberately blocked my path near the main glass entrance doors. Mr. Davis, a retired bank manager and a very long-time friend of my father, stepped aggressively into my personal space. His face was flushed red, and his jaw was tight with righteous anger. He told me I should be absolutely ashamed of myself for showing my face in this holy place. He demanded to know how I slept at night after leaving my own sweet mother to suffer and sweat in the dark. I politely asked him if he knew anything about the identity theft or the $85,000 I spent saving my parents from total bankruptcy 3 years ago. Mr. Davis laughed loudly in my face. He called me a pathetic liar. He said my father had already explained everything to the church elders. He demanded that I walk over to my parents right now, get down on my knees, and apologize for being such a ruthless and ungrateful son. The sheer volume of his booming voice drew a massive crowd of curious onlookers. Dozens of churchgoers gathered around us in a tight circle, whispering and nodding in total agreement with Mr. Davis. I was completely surrounded by a towering wall of self-righteous anger and absolute ignorance. I pushed past the hostile crowd, completely ignoring their angry muttering, and walked out through the heavy glass doors into the blinding midday sun. The sprawling asphalt parking lot was already baking in the terrible heat, shimmering with visible waves of distortion. I just wanted to reach my parked sedan and escape the suffocating hypocrisy of the entire morning. But my father was absolutely not going to let me leave quietly. Richard was standing directly next to my car, surrounded by a large group of his closest church friends. Kevin and Chloe were standing right behind him, holding hands and looking exactly like perfectly innocent wounded victims. My mother was clutching a thick leather-bound Bible to her chest, her eyes appropriately downcast for maximum theatrical effect. As I cautiously approached my vehicle, Richard puffed out his chest and took a bold step forward to block my path. He spoke very loudly, projecting his booming voice so that every single person within a 50-foot radius could clearly hear his brilliant performance. He told me I had a massive amount of nerve showing my face in the house of the Lord after the wicked things I had done to his family. I stopped a few feet away from him. I asked him if he was really going to do this right here in public in front of the entire congregation. Richard raised his voice even louder, making sure his captive audience got their money's worth. He declared that he had absolutely nothing to hide from his community. He told the gathered crowd that I was a bitter, jealous, and entitled young man who simply could not handle the rules of his respectable house. Then came the ultimate and most devastating lie of the entire morning. He looked around at his friends, placed a hand over his heart, and stated that I was nothing more than a deadbeat renter. He claimed he had graciously allowed me to rent a spare room in his beautiful home for a few years, because I was struggling to find my way in the professional world. He said I got legally evicted because I absolutely refused to pay my fair share of the monthly rent. He told them that my reaction to being kicked out was to throw a violent temper tantrum and maliciously sabotage their electricity like a spoiled child. I stared at him, genuinely amazed by the sheer magnitude of the pure fiction he was boldly creating. He was completely erasing the $85,000 I paid to stop the bank from taking his home and putting him on the street. He was entirely erasing the 3 long years I spent working 60-hour weeks at the logistics firm just to pay his overdue property taxes. He was looking at the very people he had lied to for years and feeding them a brand new elaborate lie just to cover his own pathetic financial failures. Someone in the crowd actually gasped loudly in horror. Another person muttered under their breath that I was a terrible, unredeemable son. The public humiliation was carefully designed to break me down. It was supposed to make me drop my head in profound shame, beg for their forgiveness, and run away into the shadows. Richard smiled. It was a cruel, arrogant, and triumphant little smirk. He fully believed he had completely destroyed my social reputation forever and won the ultimate victory. I stood frozen on the hot asphalt and looked at the angry, judgmental faces surrounding me. I looked at Kevin, who was desperately trying to hide a satisfied, mocking grin behind his hand. I looked at my mother, who absolutely refused to make eye contact with me, preferring to stare at the ground instead. And finally, I looked back at my father, who was happily basking in the glowing approval and sympathy of his gullible peers. Something fundamental and permanent shattered deep inside my chest in that moment, but it did not hurt at all. In fact, it felt incredibly liberating and wonderfully light. I realized in that exact second that logic, reason, and basic human morality were completely useless weapons against people who lived in a massive delusion of their own making. Trying to defend my character or explain my financial sacrifices to a crowd that desperately wanted to see me hang was a complete and total waste of oxygen. I did not need to scream at them. I did not need to desperately defend my honor. The truth was not a matter of public opinion or church gossip. The truth was recorded in permanent ink, filed safely in a county courthouse, and completely inescapable. I felt a cold, genuine smile slowly spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of any warmth or affection, and it immediately unsettled my father. His arrogant smirk faltered for just a tiny fraction of a second as he saw the pure confidence in my eyes. I stepped slightly closer to him, ignoring the whispering crowd completely. I kept my voice perfectly calm and low, just loud enough for him and his closest friends to hear over the ambient noise of the parking lot. I told him that his story was incredibly creative and highly entertaining. I looked at Kevin and then looked right back to Richard. I told my father that if I was really just a deadbeat renter, and if that big, beautiful house truly belonged to him, then he had absolutely nothing in the world to worry about. I reached into my tailored suit pocket, pulled out my electronic car keys, and unlocked the sedan with a sharp chirp. Before I opened the metal door, I looked Richard right in the eyes one last time. I told him he should probably check his mail on Monday. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove out of the crowded church parking lot, leaving them all standing together in the sweltering heat with a brand new agonizing seed of absolute terror planted firmly in their minds. Monday morning arrived with the chaotic symphony of diesel engines and backing alarms at the regional logistics hub. I sat inside my glass-enclosed office overlooking the massive warehouse floor, nursing a terrible cup of bitter breakroom coffee and reviewing the quarterly shipping manifests. The industrial environment was a welcome escape from the suffocating suburban drama of the weekend. Down here on the shipping floor, everything operated on strict logic, verifiable numbers, and signed contracts. There was no room for emotional manipulation or fabricated church gossip. I was just settling into a rhythm of productivity when my cell phone vibrated violently against the metal surface of my desk. I glanced at the glowing screen and saw my younger brother's name flashing in bright, bold letters. Part of me wanted to send the call directly to voicemail and enjoy the rest of my morning in peace. But a much darker, far more curious part of my brain needed to know what kind of delusional scheme he was cooking up next. I picked up the device, tapped the green button, and raised it to my ear without saying a single word. Kevin did not bother with a standard greeting. He did not ask how I was doing in my cheap motel room. He certainly did not mention the horrifying public spectacle our father had orchestrated in the church parking lot just 24 hours prior. Instead, he launched right into a rapid, aggressive monologue, completely ignoring reality as if we were just two normal brothers discussing standard household maintenance. He sounded incredibly annoyed, using the exact same authoritative tone our father always used when demanding obedience. Kevin informed me that the central air conditioning system in the house had completely stopped blowing cold air sometime during the night. He said the upstairs master bedroom was practically a sauna, and that Chloe was absolutely miserable trying to sleep in the terrible heat. I sat quietly in my ergonomic desk chair, staring through the glass down at the busy warehouse floor, and waited for him to reach his inevitable ridiculous point. I knew exactly how old that HVAC unit was, and I knew it was barely holding together, but Kevin was about to somehow make a mechanical failure my personal responsibility. He took a sharp breath and boldly demanded that I pay for a brand new air conditioning system immediately. He claimed that because I had occupied the house for the last 3 years, I had maliciously allowed the expensive mechanical systems to degrade under my negligent watch. He actually used the phrase improper maintenance, suggesting that my mere presence in the house had somehow destroyed the heavy condenser unit sitting in the backyard. I asked him if he was completely out of his mind. I reminded him that I had paid out of pocket to have a licensed technician patch that ancient system together twice last summer, just to keep our parents comfortable. Kevin completely dismissed my logical explanation. He insisted that as the previous tenant, I was legally and financially responsible for leaving the property in pristine, fully functional condition for the new owners. He told me he had already called an emergency repair company that morning. The technician had quoted him $8,000 for a complete system replacement. Kevin boldly declared that I needed to wire him the entire $8,000 by the end of the business day, or there would be severe legal consequences. I felt a bizarre mixture of profound exhaustion and genuine amusement washing over me. I asked Kevin exactly what kind of severe legal consequences he thought he could possibly enforce. He confidently threatened to take me to small claims court for malicious property damage. He started throwing around legal buzzwords he had clearly just searched on the internet 5 minutes before calling me. He talked about breach of implied warranty, tenant negligence, and deliberate sabotage. He painted a ridiculous picture of himself marching into a courtroom, presenting a broken fan motor to a sympathetic judge, and winning a massive financial judgment against me. He said he would garnish my wages at the logistics firm if I refused to pay up voluntarily. He was so completely high on his own false authority, so deeply entrenched in the illusion that he was the rightful king of the suburban castle, that he truly believed he could bully me into buying him luxury appliances just by mentioning a courthouse. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice or defend my actions. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, looked up at the ceiling tiles, and started to laugh. It was not a quiet, polite chuckle. It was a deep, resonant, and entirely genuine laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. The sheer, unadulterated comedy of his arrogance was simply too much to handle. I laughed at the absurdity of a man who had stolen a house, changed the locks, and participated in identity theft, now trying to threaten me with a small claims lawsuit over a rusty air conditioner. My laughter absolutely infuriated Kevin. The confident, demanding tone vanished from his voice, replaced instantly by a high-pitched, defensive anger. He demanded to know what was so incredibly funny. He shouted into the phone that this was not a joke, and that I was going to pay dearly for disrespecting his new home. He accused me of being a bitter loser who was just incredibly jealous of his massive success in his beautiful new marriage. To prove just how successful and untouchable he was, Kevin decided to completely overcompensate by bragging about his grand financial plans for the property. He sneered into the receiver and told me that $8,000 was practically nothing compared to the massive renovations he and Chloe were about to launch. He proudly announced that they were taking out a massive home equity line of credit on the house. He threw the financial term around like a shiny new toy, clearly eager to prove that he understood how real estate leverage worked. He detailed their extravagant plans with sickening enthusiasm. They were going to dig a custom saltwater swimming pool in the backyard. They were going to completely gut the outdated kitchen, tear down the structural walls to create an open-concept living space, and install imported marble countertops with a massive central island. He bragged that the bank was going to hand them over $60,000 in pure cash, based entirely on the massive amount of equity trapped inside the house. He kept talking, detailing his imaginary kingdom, completely unaware of the absolute financial guillotine hanging directly over his neck. I stopped listening to his specific design choices and let my mind drift back 3 years to a small, poorly lit attorney's office in a strip mall across town. That was the day I supposedly bailed my parents out of their terrible financial disaster. What my father had conveniently forgotten and what Kevin never bothered to learn was the actual legal mechanism I used to save the house. My parents were not just a few months behind on a standard traditional mortgage. They had taken out a predatory hard money loan from a ruthless private lender with a brutal interest rate. They were in active, unrecoverable default, and the private lender was just days away from auctioning the property on the courthouse steps. When they came to me crying and begging for help, I did not just write a massive personal check and hand it over to them on a silver platter. I knew exactly how irresponsible they were with money, and I was absolutely not going to throw away my entire life savings without a bulletproof guarantee. I hired a brilliant real estate attorney. We formed a private limited liability company entirely under my name. When I walked into that closing office 3 years ago with a certified cashier's check for $85,000, I did not pay off the loan to free my parents. I purchased the distressed promissory note directly from the private lender. I bought the debt. The legal assignment of mortgage was meticulously drafted, signed by all parties, notarized, and officially recorded in the county public registry. The original deed of trust remained firmly attached to the property, but the sole beneficiary of that massive lien was now my private company. I became the bank. I owned the paper. I dictated the terms. My parents signed a strict forbearance agreement with my company, legally acknowledging the debt and promising to make small nominal monthly payments directly to me, just to cover the property taxes and basic interest. It was a perfectly legal, ironclad financial cage designed specifically to protect my investment and keep them from borrowing against the house ever again. For the first 2 years, they made those small payments, faithfully terrified of losing their home. But as time passed, they grew entirely too comfortable. They started viewing my legal ownership as a casual family favor. And when Kevin announced his engagement to Chloe, my parents completely lost their minds. They wanted to give their golden child the ultimate wedding gift, but they had absolutely no cash. So they quietly decided to just stop paying me. They assumed that because I was their son, I would simply absorb the massive financial loss and walk away. They stopped sending the monthly checks to my company 2 full months ago. They effectively defaulted on the loan. By handing the keys over to Kevin, changing the locks, and kicking me out onto the street, they had violated multiple strict clauses in our recorded agreement. They had abandoned the property, ceased payments, and attempted to transfer possession without the explicit written consent of the lien holder. Every single arrogant action they took this weekend only strengthened my legal right to completely foreclose on the property. I snapped back to the present moment, focusing again on the sound of my brother rambling through the phone speaker. Kevin was currently bragging about a custom outdoor kitchen with a built-in stainless steel grill. He sounded so incredibly proud of himself, completely oblivious to the fact that he was enthusiastically planning to spend tens of thousands of dollars borrowing against equity that absolutely did not belong to him or our parents. I waited for him to pause and take a breath. I kept my voice entirely neutral and pleasant. I asked him exactly when he was planning to secure this massive line of credit. Kevin laughed a triumphant and condescending sound. He proudly announced that he and Chloe had an official appointment at the regional bank branch downtown at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. He said the loan officer had already pre-approved their application over the phone, and they were just going in to sign the final paperwork and secure the funds. He told me that by tomorrow morning they would have a mountain of cash, and my outdated furniture would be rotting in a landfill. I smiled. It was a cold, calculating expression that nobody else in the logistics office could see. I told Kevin that his plan sounded absolutely wonderful. I told him I sincerely hoped the bank appointment went exactly the way he deserved. My sudden shift in tone, my complete lack of anger, confused him. He stammered for a second, unsure of how to respond to my total surrender. He weakly repeated his demand for the $8,000 repair money, threatening the small claims court one last time just to regain his footing. I politely told him to send the invoice to my new address, and then I pressed the red button on my screen, disconnecting the call instantly. I dropped the phone onto my desk and leaned forward, staring out over the busy warehouse floor below. The trap was perfectly set, and my arrogant brother was happily marching straight into the jaws of absolute financial devastation. He truly believed he was walking into that bank to claim his royal inheritance. He had absolutely no idea he was about to hit a solid brick wall of legal reality. I did not waste another second. I picked up my cell phone again and dialed the direct private number of my real estate attorney, Thomas. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and highly professional. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I told him the situation had rapidly escalated over the weekend, exactly as we had anticipated when the payments stopped 2 months ago. I informed him about the illegal lockout, the changed locks, and the clear abandonment of the property by the original borrowers. I told him the 90-day cure period for their financial default was rapidly approaching its final days. But most importantly, I told him that an unauthorized occupant was currently walking into a major regional bank to attempt to leverage the property for a brand new massive loan. Thomas remained silent for a moment, absorbing the pure audacity of their actions. He let out a low whistle and confirmed that the county title records were fully updated and completely bulletproof. I instructed him to immediately draft the formal notice of default. The time for playing the dutiful son was completely over. It was time to act exactly like the bank. I was sitting in my glass-enclosed office at the logistics firm, staring at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I took a slow sip of my bitter coffee and smiled, knowing that miles away in the wealthy commercial district of our town, my younger brother was happily walking into a massive concrete wall. I knew every single detail of that bank appointment because the senior loan officer, a woman named Jessica, later provided my attorney with a completely exhaustive account of the entire spectacular meltdown. I can picture the scene unfolding with perfect cinematic clarity. Kevin and Chloe strutted through the heavy revolving glass doors of the regional bank branch. They walked into the heavily air-conditioned lobby with the absolute confidence of royalty stepping into their rightful castle. The bank branch was an upscale modern facility designed specifically to cater to high-net-worth clients in the suburbs. It featured tall frosted glass partitions, polished marble floors, and the faint welcoming aroma of freshly roasted coffee. Kevin was wearing a tight designer polo shirt and an expensive silver watch that I knew for a fact maxed out one of his credit cards. Chloe was carrying a massive leather tote bag, wearing large designer sunglasses indoors, and acting as if her mere presence was a blessing to the bank staff. They were quickly escorted into the private soundproof office of the senior loan officer. The office was plush and incredibly comfortable. Kevin sat back heavily into a thick leather chair, crossing his ankles casually. Chloe sat right next to him, immediately pulling out her brand new smartphone. She began scrolling through high-definition photos of expensive pool tile designs, paying zero attention to the financial process. They were there to secure a $60,000 home equity line of credit. In their arrogant minds, the money was already sitting in their checking account. They just needed to sign a few standard documents to make it official. They wanted to dig a massive custom saltwater swimming pool in the backyard. They wanted to tear out the perfectly good kitchen cabinets and install imported Italian marble countertops with a massive central island. Jessica sat across the heavy mahogany desk, smiling warmly. She was a seasoned banking professional with a dozen framed credentials hanging on the wall behind her. She asked them a few basic preliminary questions about their combined household income, their employment history, and their specific renovation plans. She typed the property address into her dual-monitor computer system to pull the official county title report. Kevin was practically glowing with immense pride. He leaned forward and boasted about how the massive house was completely paid off and entirely free of any financial burdens. He proudly claimed it was a very generous early wedding gift from his wealthy parents. He spoke loudly, wanting the other loan officers in the adjacent cubicles to hear about his incredible success. Jessica nodded politely, her perfectly manicured fingers flying rapidly across the quiet keyboard. She clicked a final button to submit the query directly to the county property registry. The small laser printer sitting in the corner of the office hummed to life, warming up its rollers. Jessica looked back at her main monitor to review the digital results. Slowly, the warm and professional smile on her face completely evaporated. It was replaced by a look of deep professional confusion, which rapidly shifted into extreme concern. She leaned much closer to the glowing screen, completely ignoring Kevin, who was still happily rambling about installing a built-in stainless steel outdoor grill. She scrolled down the digital page, her eyes scanning the complex legal language of the property deed. Kevin noticed the sudden and dramatic shift in her demeanor. He stopped talking mid-sentence. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, placing his hands on the edge of the mahogany desk. He asked her if the computer system was running slow, or if there was a problem with the credit check. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, suddenly looking very annoyed by the delay. Jessica took a slow, deep breath and folded her hands neatly on top of the desk. She looked directly at Kevin with a very serious, unreadable expression. She told him that she could not approve the home equity line of credit today or ever. She explained in a calm, level voice that there was absolutely no usable equity available on the property. Kevin let out a short, incredulous laugh that sounded more like a bark. He told the loan officer she must have typed the wrong address into her computer. He firmly stated that the house was located in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the entire county and was easily appraised at over $500,000. He aggressively reiterated that the property was completely paid off by his parents and did not have a single mortgage or bank loan attached to it. Jessica shook her head very slowly. She maintained steady eye contact and told Kevin that the county records painted a completely different reality. She explained that the property had a massive ironclad lien attached directly to the primary deed. It was not a traditional bank mortgage from a large commercial lender. It was a private deed of trust legally recorded and notarized exactly 3 years ago. The total monetary value of that specific lien completely eclipsed whatever available equity they thought they had. Kevin turned pale. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face. He demanded to know exactly who held this mysterious lien. Jessica read the name directly off the glowing screen. It was a private limited liability company. Kevin had absolutely no idea what that meant. His knowledge of real estate law was completely non-existent. He automatically assumed it was some kind of bizarre clerical error or a lingering paperwork mistake from when our parents originally bought the house decades ago. Chloe started to panic in her chair. She turned to Kevin, her voice rising in pitch, asking him why he promised her a custom luxury pool if they could not even secure a basic bank loan. The sheer embarrassment of being denied credit in a fancy bank office in front of his new wife was entirely too much for Kevin's massive ego to handle. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket right there in the quiet office and immediately called our father. Richard answered after only 2 rings. Kevin did not bother stepping outside into the hallway for privacy. He frantically explained the disastrous situation to Richard, his panicked voice echoing loudly off the frosted glass walls of the small office. He told his father that the incompetent bank employee was flatly refusing to give them the renovation money because of some imaginary corporate lien on the title. Through the phone receiver, Richard sounded incredibly annoyed but entirely confident. Richard boldly insisted that the house was 100% paid off and totally free and clear. He loudly declared that David had paid the bank 3 years ago and cleared the entire debt forever. He told Kevin to put the loan officer on speakerphone immediately so he could personally explain how to do her job correctly. Kevin did exactly that, slapping the phone onto the center of the mahogany desk and turning the volume all the way up. Richard began lecturing the senior loan officer through the tiny digital speaker. He used his booming, authoritative father voice. He told Jessica she was looking at severely outdated records. He proudly announced that his oldest son had written a massive cashier's check to save them from a rough patch, and that the title was completely unburdened. Jessica maintained her absolute professional composure. She did not raise her voice. She politely informed Richard that county public records do not lie, and the active lien was legally verified by the state registry just moments ago. Richard was absolutely furious. He absolutely hated being told he was wrong, especially by a bank employee questioning his financial standing. He told Kevin to stay exactly where he was. He loudly announced he was driving down to the bank branch personally to sort out this ridiculous mess once and for all. For the next 30 agonizing minutes, Kevin and Chloe sat in the office in total suffocating silence. Jessica quietly worked on other files, completely ignoring their furious glares. Suddenly, the heavy glass door of the private office swung open with tremendous force. Richard stormed into the room slightly out of breath and practically vibrating with righteous anger. He was wearing his expensive golf clothes, having clearly interrupted his leisurely retirement afternoon to deal with this massive inconvenience. He did not introduce himself to the loan officer. He marched right up to the desk, slammed both of his hands down onto the polished wood, and demanded to see the paperwork immediately. He aggressively accused the bank of trying to scam his family out of their rightful property equity. He yelled that he knew his legal rights and that absolutely nobody was going to deny his son a simple home equity loan. The commotion was so loud that several other bank customers out in the main lobby stopped what they were doing to stare at the glass office. A uniformed security guard slowly wandered over, standing cautiously near the open doorway. Jessica did not flinch or back down. She had dealt with arrogant, financially illiterate men 1,000 times before in her long career. She calmly reached over to her heavy-duty printer and pulled a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents from the tray. She tapped the edges of the thick paper on her desk to straighten them perfectly. She looked Richard right in the eye and told him she would be more than happy to show him exactly why the loan was denied. She slid the heavy stack of documents across the smooth wooden desk. The bold black text printed on the very top page clearly read, "Assignment of mortgage." Richard scoffed loudly, completely unimpressed. He reached into his golf shirt pocket, pulled out his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and aggressively shoved them onto his face. He picked up the paperwork, holding it up to the bright overhead fluorescent lights. Kevin and Chloe leaned in close, completely silent and tense. Richard scanned the first page, his eyes darting back and forth across the dense legal jargon. He read the original distressed loan amount from 3 years ago. He read his own signature at the bottom of the page, fully acknowledging the transfer of the massive debt. Then his eyes locked onto the specific section detailing the new legal owner of the promissory note. The paperwork clearly identified the private limited liability company as the sole beneficiary of the deed of trust. Jessica pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the second page of the packet. She politely instructed Richard to look at the corporate state filing documents securely attached to the deed. Richard flipped the heavy page. The blood completely and instantly drained from his face. His tanned skin turned a sickening shade of pale gray. His hands began to physically shake, causing the stiff paper to rattle loudly in the quiet office. Printed right there in black and white, verified under the official state seal, was the name of the managing member of the holding company. It was my name. David. Richard dropped the documents onto the desk, as if they had suddenly caught fire. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, his golf shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. Kevin lunged forward and grabbed the papers, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He read my name out loud. The sheer crushing reality of the situation hit them all at exactly the same terrifying time. I had never paid off their mortgage to set them free. I had legally purchased their debt from the private lender. I was the bank. I owned the financial strings to the entire property. Jessica folded her hands together again. She delivered the final devastating blow with absolute clinical precision. She explained that not only were they completely ineligible for a brand new loan, but the title pull had automatically triggered an internal risk review. She pointed to a specific paragraph highlighted in bright yellow on the third page of the document. It was the strict forbearance agreement my parents had eagerly signed 3 years ago to avoid living on the street. Jessica explained the exact terms of that legal contract to the 3 terrified people sitting in her office. The agreement strictly required continuous on-time monthly payments to the limited liability company to maintain the loan in good standing. It also strictly prohibited the transfer, gifting, or reassignment of the property to any third party without the explicit written consent of the lien holder. She looked directly at Richard and explained that by effectively giving the house to Kevin, allowing him to take possession, and completely stopping their monthly payments to my company. For the last 2 months, they had officially violated the core terms of the contract. They had triggered an immediate and catastrophic default clause. The bank was not just denying them a $60,000 luxury loan for a swimming pool. The loan officer was officially informing them that the true owner of the mortgage note had every single legal right to foreclose on the property and evict them all permanently. The plush leather chairs, the frosted glass walls, and the dreams of a custom outdoor kitchen completely shattered in an instant, replaced by the terrifying realization that they had just handed me the legal power to destroy them. The corporate headquarters of the regional logistics hub was a sprawling monument to modern efficiency. The main lobby was an expansive cavern of polished gray concrete brushed steel accents and floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the entire space in harsh, unforgiving natural light. It was a place designed for quiet professionalism and seamless corporate transactions. The ambient noise consisted of the gentle hum of central air conditioning and the soft clicking of the receptionist's keyboard. I was stepping out of the glass elevator on the ground floor holding a sleek leather folio filled with quarterly shipping reports, fully prepared to lead a routine managerial meeting in the adjacent conference room. I never made it to that meeting. As the metal elevator doors slid completely open, the serene atmosphere of the corporate lobby was violently shattered by the sound of my father shouting my name. I stopped in my tracks and looked toward the curved security desk near the main entrance. Richard and Kevin were standing there looking absolutely unhinged. The sheer contrast between their chaotic appearance and the sterile corporate environment was jarring. My father was still wearing his expensive golf shirt from the bank, but it was now completely wrinkled and soaked with large patches of nervous sweat. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, and his hair was wildly out of place. Kevin looked even worse. The confident, arrogant golden child who had mocked me on the phone just a few hours ago was now visibly trembling, his designer polo shirt clinging to his chest. They were aggressively harassing the young woman working behind the security desk, demanding that she summon me to the lobby immediately. When Richard finally spotted me standing near the elevator bank, he shoved past the velvet security stanchions and stormed directly across the polished concrete floor. He did not care that dozens of my professional colleagues were walking through the lobby. He did not care about basic human decency or public decorum. He marched right up to me, stopped mere inches from my face, and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at my chest and accused me of being a criminal mastermind. He shouted that I had completely tricked them into signing away their beautiful home. He told the entire lobby that I was a deceitful, manipulative liar who had forged corporate documents to steal his property. He demanded that I immediately call the bank and cancel the fake corporate lien so Kevin could get his renovation money. His voice echoed terribly off the high glass walls, drawing the attention of every single employee in the vicinity. I did not back away from him. I did not raise my hands in defense or show a single ounce of intimidation. I stood perfectly still, clutching my leather folio, and let him exhaust his initial wave of furious energy. When he finally paused to take a ragged breath, I spoke to him in a voice so cold and quiet that he actually had to lean forward to hear me. I told him he was making a massive fool of himself in my place of business. I reminded him that absolutely nothing was forged or hidden from him 3 years ago. I walked him through the exact memory of that day in the attorney's office. I reminded him about the licensed notary public who sat directly across the table from him. I reminded him how the notary had specifically handed him the assignment of mortgage, asked him to read the bold print, and demanded verbal confirmation that he understood he was transferring the primary debt to my holding company. I told him he signed every single page in blue ink entirely of his own free will because he was absolutely desperate to avoid living on the street. I kept my voice perfectly level as I delivered the next piece of reality. I told him the true reason he was standing in my lobby having a total meltdown was not because of some imaginary forgery. It was because he was financially incompetent. I reminded him that he and my mother had signed a strict forbearance agreement explicitly detailing their required monthly payments to my limited liability company. I looked at Kevin, who was standing just behind our father, and explained that our parents had deliberately stopped making those required payments exactly 60 days ago. They had arrogantly assumed that because I was family, I would simply ignore their massive financial default and allow them to give the property away as a wedding gift. I told my father that his total failure to pay his legal debts had consequences, and those consequences were currently locked in the county courthouse records. Kevin stood frozen on the polished concrete floor, absorbing every single word I said. The terrifying reality of the situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. The arrogant illusion of his massive inheritance was dissolving right in front of his eyes. He slowly realized that the beautiful suburban house did not belong to him. It did not belong to his new wife. It did not even belong to the parents who had so proudly gifted it to him. It belonged entirely to the brother he had mocked, evicted, and tried to humiliate. He realized that our father had not paid off the bank to secure the family legacy. Our father had simply traded one massive, inescapable debt for another and then completely failed to manage it. The custom saltwater pool, the imported marble countertops, and the luxurious debt-free lifestyle were entirely gone, replaced by the crushing realization that he was living in a house he had absolutely no legal right to occupy. The sheer embarrassment of being denied at the bank, combined with the absolute loss of his perfect future, caused something inside Kevin to completely snap. He did not yell at me. He did not try to threaten me with small claims court again. Instead, he slowly turned his head and glared directly at our father. The golden child who had spent his entire life being pampered and protected by Richard suddenly transformed into a vicious, cornered animal. Kevin stepped forward and shoved our father hard in the shoulder. He screamed at Richard, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. He demanded to know how Richard could be so incredibly stupid. He asked how his own father could lie to him for months about the house being paid off. Richard was completely taken aback by the sudden physical assault from his favorite son. He stumbled backward, his golf shoes squeaking loudly on the polished floor. He raised his hands and desperately tried to calm Kevin down, frantically whispering that they could hire a lawyer and fix the paperwork. But Kevin was entirely beyond reasoning. The screaming match erupted with terrifying intensity. Kevin loudly blamed Richard for completely ruining his new marriage. He shouted that Chloe was currently sitting in the car crying because she thought she had married a successful homeowner, only to discover she had married a broke tenant living in a house owned by his estranged brother. Kevin called our father a pathetic failure. He screamed that Richard had humiliated him in front of the loan officer and completely destroyed his life. Richard finally snapped back, his face turning purple with rage. He ordered Kevin to shut his mouth and show some respect. The two men stood in the center of the corporate lobby, screaming terrible, unforgivable insults at each other, while dozens of my coworkers watched in absolute stunned silence. The massive disruption was completely destroying the professional environment of the logistics firm. I had seen enough. I caught the eye of the head of building security, a massive former military man named John, who was already walking rapidly toward our position with 3 other uniformed guards right behind him. I gave John a curt nod and pointed directly at my father and brother. I clearly stated that these 2 men were trespassing, causing a severe disturbance, and needed to be removed from the private property immediately. The security team did not hesitate. They moved in with practiced mechanical efficiency. 2 guards grabbed Richard by the arms, while John and the 4th guard flanked Kevin. Richard tried to violently rip his arms away, shouting that he had every right to be there and that he was not finished talking to me. John simply applied a firm, painful grip to my father's upper arm, instantly cutting off his protest. Kevin continued to scream at Richard, completely ignoring the security guards as they physically turned him around. They were dragged backward across the polished concrete floor, their expensive shoes scuffing the pristine surface. They were forcefully pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and out into the sweltering heat of the front plaza. I stood perfectly still in the quiet lobby holding my leather folio and watched them stumble out onto the concrete pavement. The heavy glass doors stopped spinning, returning the lobby to a state of absolute peaceful silence. I walked slowly toward the front windows and looked out at the massive visitor parking lot. Richard and Kevin were still arguing aggressively on the hot pavement, shoving each other as they walked blindly toward their parked vehicles. They were so completely consumed by their own internal family warfare that they absolutely did not notice the unremarkable silver sedan parked directly next to my father's luxury car. They also did not notice the tall, broadly built man wearing a plain gray suit leaning casually against the trunk of that sedan. This man was not a random logistics employee or a lost delivery driver. He was a licensed professional process server, hired directly by my real estate attorney just a few hours prior. We knew Richard would never willingly open his front door to accept legal documents, so my attorney paid a premium to have the server track his vehicle from the bank directly to my workplace. The server had been patiently waiting in the baking heat for this exact moment. As my father stormed past the silver sedan, still screaming insults at Kevin, the man in the gray suit stepped smoothly into his path. The process server asked Richard to confirm his full legal name. Richard, completely blinded by rage, aggressively yelled his name out loud, demanding to know what the man wanted. The server did not flinch. He simply reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope, and slapped it firmly against my father's sweaty chest. Richard reflexively brought his arms up and caught the heavy envelope before it hit the pavement. The server loudly declared that Richard had been officially served, then turned around and casually got into his silver car. I stood safely behind the thick glass walls of my office building and watched my father rip open the envelope. I watched his shoulders completely collapse as he pulled out the official legally binding notice of default. The countdown to their total destruction had officially begun. The sheer panic that consumed my parents over the next 48 hours was entirely of their own making. Richard spent 2 full days sitting at the edge of the kitchen island, furiously dialing the phone number of every single real estate attorney listed in the county directory. He was desperately searching for a legal loophole to save his massive ego and his suburban kingdom. He marched into 3 different prestigious law offices downtown, carrying the thick manila envelope that the process server had slapped onto his chest in the logistics firm parking lot. He aggressively demanded that these attorneys take his case on a contingency basis, firmly believing he was the victim of a massive corporate fraud. He wanted them to sue my limited liability company, void the deed of trust, and force me to pay emotional damages. But high-powered real estate lawyers do not operate on emotion or church parking lot gossip. They operate strictly on verifiable documents. Every single attorney looked at the legally recorded assignment of mortgage, reviewed the signed forbearance agreement, and immediately showed my father the door. The paperwork I had secured 3 years ago was absolutely flawless. The legal clauses were ironclad. My parents had officially and voluntarily surrendered their equity when they defaulted on their payments and handed the keys to my brother. There was no contingency case because there was absolutely no chance of winning. One senior partner actually laughed in my father's face, politely informing him that no competent lawyer would ever attempt to fight a perfectly executed private mortgage note without a massive upfront retainer. Since Richard had completely drained his liquid savings to pay for Kevin's extravagant wedding and those lavish Hawaiian honeymoon tickets, he did not have a single dollar to hire legal counsel. The terrifying reality of their financial doom finally settled heavily over the house. When the aggressive legal route completely collapsed, my mother decided to deploy her favorite weapon. She relied entirely on emotional manipulation. I had just signed a 6-month lease on a quiet, furnished apartment on the other side of town to give myself a comfortable base of operations while the foreclosure process played out. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting at my small dining table eating dinner when the doorbell chimed. I opened the heavy wooden door to find Susan standing in the dimly lit hallway. She was holding a large wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. The distinct sweet smell of freshly baked blueberry muffins filled the corridor. It was the exact same recipe she used to bake for me when I was a little boy recovering from the flu. Her eyes were wide and brimming with carefully calculated tears. She looked small, frail, and incredibly pathetic. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped past me into the apartment and placed the basket gently on the kitchen counter. She turned around, clasped her hands tightly together in front of her chest, and began to weep. It was a spectacular theatrical performance. She told me she had not slept a single minute since the terrible misunderstanding at the bank. She completely ignored her own role in the utility fraud and the illegal eviction, framing the entire situation as a simple family disagreement that had sadly gotten out of hand. She begged me to remember the good times we shared in that big house. She spoke softly about forgiveness, quoting the same religious scriptures Pastor Miller used to guilt his congregation. Then she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a quitclaim deed. She slid it across my kitchen counter right next to the muffins. She looked up at me with pleading, watery eyes and asked me to just sign the document. She said if I signed away my corporate rights and legally transferred the property title over to Kevin, we could forget all the ugliness and finally be a family again. She promised they would invite me over for Sunday dinners and that I could be an uncle to her future grandchildren. I stood there looking at the woman who had happily watched my father throw my broken suitcase onto the concrete driveway just a few days ago. The sheer audacity of bringing baked goods to a man you committed a felony against was genuinely breathtaking. I did not raise my voice, but I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I looked down at the quitclaim deed, then looked directly into her crying eyes. I asked her if she thought a basket of muffins was worth $85,000. The tears instantly stopped flowing, replaced by a sudden flash of genuine panic. I calmly reminded her of the heavy leather suitcase hitting the pavement. I reminded her of the shiny new deadbolt on the front door. I recounted the exact moment I received the automated emails confirming she had fraudulently transferred thousands of dollars of utility debt into my name to ruin my credit score. Finally, I brought up the church parking lot. I described how she stood there clutching her Bible in perfect silence while my father proudly told the entire congregation that I was nothing more than a deadbeat renter, being evicted for not paying my fair share. I told her that a real mother would never allow her oldest son to be publicly destroyed just to protect her youngest child from taking responsibility for his own life. I picked up the blank quitclaim deed, folded it neatly in half, and dropped it straight into the garbage can under the sink. I pointed toward the front door and told her my time acting as the family bank was permanently over. She tried to open her mouth to argue, but the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped her completely. She grabbed her empty handbag, leaving the muffins on the counter, and practically ran out of the apartment. I closed the door firmly behind her, locking the deadbolt with a deeply satisfying click. Back at the sprawling suburban house, an entirely different kind of fracture was rapidly tearing the perfect newlywed couple apart. Chloe had spent her entire engagement believing she was marrying a wealthy, successful man who owned a massive estate free and clear. She was deeply materialistic, driven entirely by social status and the outward appearance of luxury. The disastrous revelation inside the bank office had completely shattered her carefully constructed reality. For 2 days, she had locked herself inside the master bedroom, furiously scrolling through her phone and making long, hushed phone calls to her own mother. Kevin spent those 48 hours pacing the downstairs living room, desperately trying to convince her that his father was going to hire a brilliant lawyer to fix everything. He promised her the custom saltwater pool was still going to happen. He promised her they would never have to move. But Chloe was not stupid when it came to money. She understood exactly what a notice of default meant. She knew that my limited liability company held the absolute legal right to seize the property, evict them, and sell the house at a public auction. On Wednesday morning, Kevin walked up the carpeted stairs carrying a cup of coffee, hoping to apologize and smooth things over. He opened the master bedroom door and stopped dead in his tracks. Chloe was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by 4 massive, expensive designer suitcases. She was rapidly pulling her expensive silk dresses and designer shoes out of the closet and aggressively shoving them into the bags. Kevin dropped the coffee mug. It shattered against the doorframe, spilling hot brown liquid all over the plush carpet. He frantically rushed into the room and begged her to stop packing. He reached out to grab her arm, but she slapped his hand away with absolute disgust. She looked at him not with anger, but with pure, unadulterated contempt. She told him he was a complete fraud. She said she refused to be legally tied to a sinking ship, and she absolutely refused to spend the first year of her marriage living in poverty while battling an eviction notice. Kevin started crying. The confident golden boy completely broke down in front of her, begging her to stay and fight this battle with him. He blamed me, he blamed the bank, and he blamed his parents. Chloe zipped up her largest suitcase, grabbed the extendable handle, and rolled it right over the spilled coffee. She coldly informed him that she was moving back into her parents' house across town. She said she was going to call a divorce attorney by the end of the week because she had absolutely no intention of being saddled with his massive family debts. Kevin followed her all the way down the stairs, crying and pleading, but she did not even look back. She loaded her expensive luggage into her car, started the engine, and drove away without a single wave goodbye, completely destroying Kevin's perfect new marriage before the honeymoon tan even faded from his skin. The sound of Chloe's car driving away echoed loudly in the quiet suburban cul-de-sac. Kevin stood on the front porch for a long time, staring at the empty street. His entire world had evaporated in less than a week. The beautiful house was slipping through his fingers. His gorgeous new wife had abandoned him at the very first sign of financial struggle. His pristine reputation in the community was about to be obliterated when the foreclosure became public record. A deep, poisonous rage began to boil up inside his chest. He turned around and walked back inside the house, slamming the heavy wooden door shut with enough force to rattle the glass windows. Richard and Susan were sitting quietly in the living room, surrounded by the outdated furniture they had refused to let me take. They looked exhausted and utterly defeated. Kevin marched into the center of the room, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He did not ask for their comfort. He did not seek their parental guidance. He looked directly at the 2 people who had spent 28 years spoiling him rotten, and he blamed them for every single terrible thing that was happening to him. He screamed that Richard was a complete failure of a father for secretly putting the house into debt. He screamed at Susan for poorly managing the utility bills and triggering my retaliation. He yelled that he had just lost the love of his life because they were too poor and too stupid to handle their own mortgage. Richard tried to stand up to defend himself, but Kevin violently kicked a wooden coffee table, sending it crashing into the wall. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his terrified parents. He delivered a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. He demanded that Richard and Susan immediately call their financial advisors and completely empty their retirement accounts. He did not care about the massive tax penalties. He did not care if they had to eat cat food for the rest of their elderly lives. He demanded they cash out every single penny they had saved for their old age and use that money to pay off my limited liability company in full. He told them it was the only possible way to save the house, get his wife back, and fix the massive disaster they had created. He stood over them, breathing heavily, and swore that if they refused to sacrifice their retirement funds to save him, he would walk out the front door and they would never see their precious golden child ever again. 90 days can feel like a fleeting moment when you are happy and comfortable. But for my parents, those 3 months dragged on like a slow, suffocating prison sentence. The legal cure period dictated by the county foreclosure laws ticked away relentlessly. Every single morning they woke up in their luxurious master bedroom, knowing the absolute deadline was creeping closer and closer. After Kevin delivered his brutal ultimatum demanding they fix the disaster, Richard and Susan completely panicked. They contacted their financial advisor and completely liquidated what little they had left in their combined retirement accounts. They eagerly swallowed the massive early withdrawal penalties and the severe federal tax hits, blindly hoping that a large lump sum of cash would magically save their suburban kingdom. But the financial math was entirely unforgiving and completely undeniable. After paying off the lavish Hawaiian honeymoon, the expensive wedding venue, and years of living far beyond their actual means, their cashed-out retirement accounts barely amounted to $30,000. It was an incredibly pathetic sum of money. It did not even come close to covering the original $85,000 principal they owed my holding company, let alone the accrued interest, the late fees, and the substantial legal costs of the foreclosure process itself. They were completely trapped in a financial corner with absolutely no way out. Instead of accepting reality and packing their boxes, my parents chose the path of total delusion. They absolutely refused to vacate the premises. They decided to play a twisted game of suburban pretend acting, as if the legally recorded notice of default was simply a bad dream that would fade away if they ignored it long enough. Susan continued to water the bright red geraniums hanging on the front porch every single morning. Richard proudly fired up his expensive riding lawnmower every Saturday, waving cheerfully at the passing neighbors and maintaining the flawless green grass of a house he no longer legally owned. They smiled at the local grocery store, attended Sunday services, and projected an image of perfect, untroubled wealth. But behind the heavy wooden front door, the atmosphere was completely rotting away. The inside of the house had become a dark, miserable tomb. Kevin was living in the unfinished basement surrounded by concrete walls and empty cardboard boxes. Since Chloe had packed her designer bags and filed for a rapid divorce, he had completely spiraled into a deep, toxic depression. He stopped going to his fancy corporate job and was eventually fired for unexcused absences. He spent his days drinking heavily, leaving empty glass bottles scattered all across the cold concrete floor. He blamed everyone in the world for his failures, shouting terrible insults up the wooden stairs at our parents late into the night. Richard and Susan tiptoed around their own home, terrified of triggering another one of his violent, drunken outbursts. They lived in a constant state of agonizing tension, clinging desperately to the walls of the house, while their perfect family unit completely disintegrated around them. The final morning of the 90-day period dawned with a crisp, cool autumn breeze that felt entirely out of place for the heavy, suffocating nature of the day. I woke up in my quiet apartment, drank a full cup of black coffee, and put on a sharply tailored navy blue suit. I did not feel a single trace of guilt or sadness. I felt the profound, crystal-clear focus of a man who was finally completing a long and exhausting task. The legal deadline had officially expired at midnight. The property now belonged entirely to my limited liability company. I drove my sedan across town, navigating the familiar tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood, for the absolute last time as a victim. I pulled up to the curb directly in front of the house and shifted the car into park. A massive white and green county sheriff patrol vehicle was already idling in the driveway. The heavy diesel engine rumbled softly in the quiet suburban street. A tall, broad-shouldered deputy stepped out of the cruiser. He was wearing a crisp uniform, a heavy tactical vest, and a serious expression that indicated he had zero patience for domestic drama. I walked up the concrete driveway and shook his hand. I handed him the finalized court-ordered writ of possession, signed by a county judge. The deputy reviewed the thick legal document, nodded once to confirm the details, and asked me if I anticipated any physical violence from the occupants. I told him my father was a coward who only fought with his words, but that my brother was currently living in the basement and might be heavily intoxicated. The deputy rested his hand casually near his utility belt and instructed me to stand back while he initiated the contact. We walked together up the concrete path toward the front porch. The neighborhood was wide awake and watching. The sight of a marked county sheriff vehicle parked aggressively in my parents' driveway acted like a massive siren for the local gossips. Mrs. Gable stopped watering her front lawn and stood perfectly still, her garden hose flooding the grass as she openly stared. Mr. Davis paused his morning walk holding his golden retriever by the leash and slowly edged closer to get a better view. Across the street, I spotted the familiar black sedan belonging to Pastor Miller. He had been visiting another elderly congregant in the neighborhood and had conveniently parked nearby to watch the spectacle unfold. The audience was perfectly assembled, completely unaware that they were about to witness the absolute destruction of my parents' carefully crafted social facade. The deputy stepped onto the porch and pounded his heavy fist against the wooden front door. The sound echoed loudly down the quiet street. He announced himself as the county sheriff and ordered the occupants to open the door immediately. For a long, agonizing minute, there was absolute silence from inside the house. Then the shiny new deadbolt clicked. The door swung open to reveal Richard. My father looked terrible. His face was pale and deeply lined with stress. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt and his hands were shaking slightly. He looked at the uniformed deputy, then his eyes darted over to me standing near the steps. The moment he saw my face, his initial shock instantly morphed into a frantic, desperate rage. He completely ignored the armed law enforcement officer standing on his welcome mat. He stepped out onto the porch, puffed out his chest, and decided to play his favorite role one final time. He looked past the deputy and directly at the gathering crowd of neighbors on the sidewalk. Richard began to shout at the absolute top of his lungs, projecting his voice so that every single person on the block could hear his tragic performance. He yelled that this was a massive illegal mistake. He pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed that his evil, vindictive son was using a fake corporation to steal his family home. He told the watching crowd that he had paid his mortgage faithfully for 20 years and that I had maliciously manipulated the legal system to throw my own elderly parents out onto the cold street. Susan suddenly appeared behind him in the doorway, clutching a small decorative pillow to her chest and weeping loudly. She wailed that they had absolutely nowhere to go. She cried out to Pastor Miller, begging him to intervene and stop this terrible sin from happening. Pastor Miller took a few hesitant steps toward the edge of the lawn, looking deeply concerned and visibly outraged by my apparent cruelty. The neighbors began to murmur among themselves, their faces twisting with disgust as they looked at me. Richard fed off their sympathetic energy. He raised his arms in the air like a persecuted martyr. He shouted that I had completely ruined my brother's beautiful marriage. He claimed I was a greedy monster who cared more about money than the sacred bond of blood. He demanded that the deputy arrest me for fraud, insisting that a good Christian man like himself would never deserve such a terrible fate. Right at that moment, Kevin stumbled up from the basement and appeared in the doorway next to our mother. He was wearing stained sweatpants and a dirty t-shirt. His eyes were bloodshot and he looked completely exhausted. He leaned against the door frame, glaring out at the crowd, and then at me. Richard saw Kevin and immediately used him as a prop. Richard grabbed Kevin's shoulder and yelled to the neighbors that I had driven this poor boy into depression by stealing his home and his wife. Richard challenged me to look him in the eye and justify my wicked actions to the entire community. He demanded that I explain to Pastor Miller and Mr. Davis why I was violently destroying a loving family over a simple misunderstanding. He truly believed that if he screamed loud enough, if he generated enough public outrage, the sheriff would somehow pack up and leave. He believed the sheer weight of his community reputation would somehow magically override a signed order from a county judge. I stood at the bottom of the concrete steps, completely silent. I did not yell back at him. I did not wave my arms or try to passionately defend my character to the whispering crowd. I let him scream until his throat was raw and his face was purple. I let the neighbors hear every single desperate, pathetic lie he wanted to tell. The air was thick with tension, the kind of heavy, suffocating pressure that precedes a massive storm. When Richard finally ran out of breath and stood there panting on the porch, the entire street fell into a profound, ringing silence. Everyone was staring directly at me, waiting for my angry rebuttal. They expected a massive shouting match. They expected me to crumble under the heavy weight of their collective moral judgment. Instead of raising my voice, I slowly reached down into the heavy leather briefcase sitting on the pavement next to my feet. I unclasped the brass locks with a sharp, echoing click. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized manila folder. It was heavy, packed tightly with dozens of printed documents, bank statements, and legal affidavits. I held the thick folder firmly in my right hand. I looked past my father, past my weeping mother, and locked eyes directly with Pastor Miller, who was standing near the mailbox. I did not need to shout. The truth was resting right in the palm of my hand, ready to completely obliterate their false reality. This was the final receipt, and it was going to destroy them all. The crisp morning air hung completely still as I stepped away from the bottom of the concrete stairs. I did not walk up to the porch to argue with my father. I completely ignored his flushed red face and his heavy theatrical breathing. Instead, I turned my back to the house and walked directly across the damp green grass toward the public sidewalk. I approached Pastor Miller, who was standing next to the brick mailbox with his arms tightly crossed across his chest in a stance of absolute moral authority. He looked at me with deep pastoral disappointment, but I did not offer him a single word of apology or explanation. I opened the thick manila folder and pulled out a tall stack of neatly stapled paper packets. I held them out and handed the very first packet directly to the pastor. He looked down at the white paper as if it were coated in something toxic, but his natural human curiosity forced his hands to reach out and take it. I turned my attention to Mr. Davis, who was standing just a few feet away, gripping the leash of his golden retriever. I handed him a heavy packet without saying a word. I walked slowly over to Mrs. Gable, who had finally shut off her running garden hose to watch the unfolding drama from the edge of her driveway. I handed her a packet as well. I handed copies to every single nosy neighbor who had gathered on the street to witness my supposed cruelty. I had spent the entire previous evening meticulously printing and collating these specific financial documents because I knew exactly how my father operated in times of intense crisis. I knew he would try to turn his legal eviction into a massive public spectacle to save his own ego. I knew he would desperately attempt to use his church community as a human shield against his own failures. So I decided to provide his chosen audience with the absolute undeniable truth. Richard suddenly stopped panting on the porch. He realized I was not handing out letters of apology. He watched his closest friends looking down at the legal papers, and a fresh wave of panic washed over his face. He yelled from the top of the stairs, demanding to know what I was distributing to his neighbors. He ordered Pastor Miller not to read the lies I had printed, but it was entirely too late. The heavy silence of the suburban street was suddenly broken by the sound of pages turning. The very first page of the packet was a direct copy of the original distress notice from the private lender dated exactly 3 years ago. It clearly showed that Richard and Susan were deeply in default and merely days away from a total public foreclosure. Right beneath that notice was a copy of the certified cashier's check I had personally drawn from my own life savings. The amount of $85,000 was printed in bold black ink right next to my legal name. Mr. Davis adjusted his reading glasses and stared at the numbers. His jaw literally dropped. For years, my father had bragged to these exact people about his brilliant stock market investments and his massive retirement funds. He had presented himself as a titan of suburban financial success. The paper in their hands completely shattered that illusion in 10 seconds. It proved that the great Richard was entirely broke 3 years ago, and that his oldest son had quietly sacrificed his own future to keep a roof over the family. I watched Pastor Miller scan the first page. The self-righteous anger that had clouded his face just a few moments ago began to slowly melt away, replaced by a look of profound confusion. He looked up at Richard and then back down at the paper. He flipped to the second page. This page contained the legal assignment of mortgage securely transferring the deed of trust to my limited liability company. It completely debunked my father's loud claims that I was just a deadbeat renter. The paperwork definitively proved that I was the legal bank and that Richard was nothing more than a failing tenant who had stopped paying his bills. My father stumbled down the first 2 concrete steps of the porch. His voice cracked as he tried to regain control of the narrative. He shouted that those documents were forged and that I was trying to confuse everyone with fake corporate paperwork. He begged his friends to look at him and remember the man they had known for 20 years, but nobody looked up at him. They were entirely captivated by the story unfolding in the stapled packets. They reached the 3rd section of the folder. This was the section that made my mother physically gasp and cover her mouth with both hands. I had included the official police report I filed regarding the fraudulent utility transfers. I attached the automated disconnection emails from the Regional Power Authority right next to the formal complaint. The documents clearly showed that Susan had deliberately stolen my Social Security number to open past due accounts in my name. The sheer criminality of the act was laid out in plain English for her entire church community to read. The older women in the crowd who had baked pies with my mother and prayed with her on Sunday mornings gasped audibly. They read the exact dollar amounts she had tried to steal from her own son. Susan tried to hide behind the heavy wooden door frame, but the damage was already permanently done. Her flawless reputation as a pious and loving Christian mother evaporated into thin air. She was exposed as a manipulative felon who would gladly ruin her child's financial future to save a few dollars. Pastor Miller read the police report, and his hands actually began to tremble. He had called me just a few weeks prior to lecture me about the terrible sin of greed. He had accused me of turning off the electricity out of pure spite and malice. Now he was holding the undeniable proof that my parents had completely lied to him. They had used his sacred position as a pastor to wage a dirty social war against me. They had made him an unwitting accomplice in their massive web of deception. But the final document in the packet was the absolute most devastating piece of evidence. During the initial foreclosure proceedings, my real estate attorney had required Richard to submit a written explanation for his sudden cessation of payments to my company. In his supreme arrogance and total financial ignorance, Richard had actually submitted a sworn written affidavit, trying to justify his actions. In that legal document, he openly admitted that he intentionally stopped paying me because he felt he had the parental right to transfer my equity to Kevin. He explicitly wrote that David makes enough money at his logistics job and Kevin needs the house for his new bride. He put his massive favoritism and his deliberate theft onto a legally binding document and signed it under the penalty of perjury. Mr. Davis read that final paragraph out loud. His booming voice carried across the quiet street, echoing off the brick facades of the expensive houses. He read my father's exact words, detailing the calculated plan to steal $85,000 from one son to buy the love of another. The sheer wicked reality of that admission hung heavily in the morning air. Richard stood frozen on the concrete steps. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His lies were completely exhausted. The false reality he had so carefully constructed over the last 2 decades was reduced to ashes in front of his very eyes. He looked at the faces of his neighbors and saw nothing but absolute disgust and total rejection. The people he had tried to impress for years were now looking at him like he was a dangerous stranger. Pastor Miller slowly closed the thick packet. He folded the papers in half and gripped them tightly in his right hand. He did not look angry anymore. He looked completely heartbroken and deeply embarrassed. He had allowed himself to be manipulated by a man he trusted, and he had publicly condemned an innocent man in front of his entire congregation. The pastor took a slow, deliberate step backward away from the edge of the property line. He looked directly at my father standing on the porch. He told Richard in a very quiet, incredibly firm voice that he needed to pray for his own soul. He said he could not believe the absolute darkness he had just read. Pastor Miller turned his back on my parents and slowly walked away down the sidewalk, heading straight toward his parked car. He did not look back once. Mr. Davis shook his head in pure disgust. He tossed the packet onto the green grass, threw his hands up in the air, and walked away, pulling his golden retriever behind him. Mrs. Gable just stared at my mother with a look of terrifying judgment before silently retreating into her own house and locking the door. One by one, the entire crowd of neighbors dispersed. They did not offer any words of comfort to my parents. They did not shout or argue. They simply walked away, leaving Richard and Susan completely isolated and entirely exposed. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. The sheriff deputy, who had watched the entire interaction from the edge of the driveway, simply adjusted his duty belt and stepped forward. He looked at my father and told him the show was officially over. He instructed Richard to step aside so the property could be legally secured. Before Richard could even open his mouth to offer one last pathetic defense, a shadow moved in the doorway. Kevin stepped out onto the porch, pushing past our weeping mother. He looked completely shattered. The heavy drinking, the loss of his wife, and the crushing realization of his own utter failure had drained every single ounce of arrogance from his body. He looked at the empty street where the neighbors had just stood. He looked at the discarded legal packets lying on the damp grass. Then he looked at our father. Kevin did not yell. He did not throw a violent tantrum like he had in the corporate lobby. His voice was completely hollow and defeated. He told Richard to just shut up. He said those exact words with a terrifying lack of emotion. He told his father to stop fighting and just give it up. He admitted out loud that they had lost absolutely everything. He said there was no lawyer coming to save them and no community left to protect them. Kevin looked at me standing calmly at the bottom of the stairs. He did not apologize, but the sheer defeat in his eyes was a massive victory in itself. Kevin turned around and walked slowly back into the dark house. He grabbed a small duffel bag he had packed the night before and walked right past the sheriff deputy. He walked down the concrete driveway, dragging his feet, keeping his head bowed entirely toward the ground. He climbed into his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving our parents completely alone to face the devastating consequences of their own actions. Richard and Susan were left standing on the porch of a house they no longer owned, surrounded by neighbors who would never speak to them again. The social facade had completely crumbled, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth of a final receipt. The heavy boots of the county sheriff deputy echoed loudly on the wooden porch boards. He did not ask them nicely. He gave my family a firm 10-minute warning to gather whatever personal items they could physically carry and step off the legal property line. The absolute finality of the law was a harsh language my parents had never been forced to speak until this very moment. Susan scrambled back into the house with her face completely red and stained with heavy tears. She frantically threw loose clothing and family photo albums into flimsy cardboard boxes. Richard moved like a man walking underwater. He dragged his feet through the grand foyer, pulling a large rolling suitcase behind him. The irony of that specific suitcase was not lost on me. It was not my broken vintage leather bag, but the visual parallel was completely perfect. Just a few months ago, they had stood on this exact porch, acting like untouchable royalty while they threw my belongings onto the concrete driveway. They had locked me out of the home I had rescued and told me I was entirely dead to them. Now the roles were violently and legally reversed. They stumbled down the concrete stairs under the watchful eye of the armed deputy. Susan was clutching a plastic bin filled with bathroom toiletries and loose shoes. Richard was struggling to roll his heavy luggage across the damp grass. Kevin had returned from his car, having realized he forgot his remaining clothes in the basement. He emerged from the side door carrying 2 oversized trash bags filled with his expensive designer wardrobe. The 3 of them gathered on the edge of the front lawn, right next to the public sidewalk. They looked completely pathetic. The massive suburban house towered behind them, casting a long mourning shadow over their exhausted faces. They had absolutely no moving truck waiting for them. They had no luxury condo reserved across town. They were completely homeless. The sheriff stood at the edge of the driveway and pointed a stern finger toward the street. He informed them that if they stepped foot on the grass again, they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. I watched them drag their bags down the sidewalk toward my father's luxury car. I did not feel a sudden rush of pity. I did not feel the urge to call them back and offer a last-minute compromise. I felt the heavy, exhausting burden of the last 3 years finally lifting off my shoulders. The deputy handed me the new brass keys the locksmith had just finished installing on the front door. I thanked the officer for his time and shook his hand. He got back into his cruiser and drove away, leaving me entirely alone on the property. I walked up the steps and inserted the brand new key into the shiny deadbolt. I turned the lock, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the quiet foyer. The house was completely silent. The chaotic energy of my family had been entirely scrubbed from the walls. I walked slowly through the empty living room where my expensive leather sectional used to sit. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the outdated wooden cabinets that Kevin and Chloe had desperately wanted to destroy for their luxury renovations. The emotional weight of the betrayal still lingered in the corners of the rooms. This was the place where I had grown up. This was the place I had sacrificed my youth and my financial stability to protect. But as I walked through the empty hallways, the sentimental attachment completely dissolved. It was no longer a childhood home. It was just an asset. It was a structure made of wood and brick that I legally owned. I pulled my cell phone from my suit pocket and dialed the number of the most aggressive real estate agent in the entire county. A woman named Barbara answered the call on the first ring. I told her I had a massive suburban property completely vacant and ready to be listed immediately. I did not want to wait for the spring market. I did not want to stage the rooms with fake furniture or host weeks of tedious open houses. I instructed Barbara to list the property $20,000 below the current market value. I wanted a brutally fast cash sale. I wanted to liquidate the asset, extract my money, and permanently erase this physical anchor from my life. Barbara arrived at the property less than an hour later with her digital camera and a stack of listing agreements. She walked through the spacious rooms and confidently assured me that at my discounted price the house would spark an absolute bidding war among local investors. I signed the listing paperwork right there on the kitchen counter, locked the front door, and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror. The real estate market responded exactly as Barbara had predicted. Because the property was located in a highly desirable neighborhood and priced significantly below the standard valuation, we received 5 competitive cash offers within the first 48 hours. I did not even entertain the offers that required complicated bank financing or lengthy home inspections. I selected a pristine all-cash offer from a corporate relocation firm that wanted to close the transaction in less than 14 days. The entire process moved with blinding speed. There were no emotional negotiations. There were no family arguments over who deserved the money. It was a pure clinical business transaction. 2 weeks later, I sat in the polished conference room of a downtown title company. A professional escrow officer slid a massive stack of closing documents across the long wooden table. I signed my name in blue ink, transferring the legal deed from my limited liability company over to the corporate buyers. When the final signature was complete, the officer smiled and handed me a certified bank draft. I stared at the numbers printed on the thick paper. The financial vindication was absolute and incredibly sweet. I did not just recover my original $85,000 investment. The county real estate values had skyrocketed over the last 3 years. After paying the standard closing costs, the realtor commissions, and the final legal fees, I walked away with my entire initial investment plus an additional $70,000 in pure captured equity. My parents had unknowingly handed me a massive financial windfall when they decided to stop paying their bills and illegally evict me. They had tried to steal my money to fund a wedding, but they had ended up fully funding my future wealth instead. I walked out of the title office and deposited the massive check directly into my high-yield savings account. The numbers on my banking application updated instantly, reflecting a level of financial security I had never experienced before. But the true payoff was not just the money. The true payoff was watching the brutal, uncompromising reality of the real world finally crash down on the people who thought they were entirely above the rules. The local gossip network in my hometown was incredibly efficient. I did not have to speak to a single person to learn exactly what happened to my family. The stories filtered back to me through mutual acquaintances and former coworkers. Richard and Susan were completely banished from their social circles. The public unveiling on the front lawn had permanently destroyed their reputation. Pastor Miller refused to return their phone calls. The church elders politely suggested they find another congregation to attend. With absolutely no savings left and their pristine credit scores completely destroyed by the foreclosure, they could not secure a lease for a respectable house anywhere in the county. They were ultimately forced to move into a cramped, poorly maintained two-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of town. The building was situated directly next to a noisy commercial train track. There were no manicured lawns or neighborhood association potlucks. There was only the constant rattling of freight trains and the crushing reality of their new poverty. Richard was forced to take a minimum wage job as a greeter at a local hardware store just to afford their basic groceries. He spent his days wearing a bright orange vest, smiling at strangers, while his massive ego slowly suffocated inside him. Susan spent her days sitting in the tiny apartment watching daytime television and blaming everyone else for her misery. Kevin's grand future collapsed even faster than our parents' retirement plans. Chloe did exactly what she promised to do. She moved back into her parents' luxury home and immediately hired a ruthless divorce attorney. Because they were only married for a few months and Kevin had absolutely no assets to his name, the legal proceedings were fast and incredibly brutal. Chloe successfully argued that Kevin had completely misrepresented his financial standing to secure her consent to the marriage. She dragged his name through the local family court, painting him as a deceptive broke loser who lived in his parents' basement. Kevin was completely humiliated. He lost his beautiful wife, he lost the massive house he thought he owned, and he completely lost his status as the golden child. He was forced to rent a tiny single room in a shared boarding house, living with 3 strangers who did not care about his designer clothes or his expensive tastes. He tried to call me once from an unknown number late on a Friday night. I listened to his voicemail the next morning. He was crying, begging me to loan him $5,000 to pay for a cheap used car so he could find a new job. I deleted the message immediately without a second thought. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my contact list. I scrolled down to my father's name, my mother's name, and my brother's name. With 3 simple taps on the glass screen, I permanently blocked their numbers. I blocked their email addresses. I blocked them on every single social media platform. I completely severed the rotten branch of my family tree. I was no longer their emergency bank account. I was no longer the scapegoat for their terrible financial decisions. I was entirely free. I sat on the balcony of my new apartment looking out over the city skyline. The heavy, suffocating drama that had consumed my entire adult life was finally gone. I opened my laptop and navigated to a travel website. I had spent 3 years working 60-hour weeks and dumping every single spare dollar into a house that brought me absolutely nothing but pain. It was finally time to spend my own money on myself. I booked a first-class ticket for a 3-week vacation to a remote island resort in the Mediterranean. I reserved a private villa overlooking the bright blue ocean. I wanted to wake up every morning to the sound of crashing waves instead of screaming arguments. The story of my family was a brutal lesson in the dangers of unearned entitlement and toxic loyalty. They truly believed they could use me, drain my resources, and throw me out onto the street without facing a single consequence. They thought family blood was a magical shield that protected them from the rigid laws of the real world. But they forgot that I was the one holding the receipts. I was the one who signed the contracts. I was the one who actually understood how the world worked. In the end, they did not just lose their beautiful suburban home. They lost their dignity, they lost their community, and they completely lost the only person who had ever truly tried to save them. I closed my laptop, picked up my hot cup of coffee, and smiled at the bright morning sun, completely ready to start the rest of my life.